This is the true story
True story.
of two therapists in love.
The real deal.
No BS.
How we deal with anger.
How we recover from a fight.
And how we show up
courageously,
authentically,
and vulnerably
to create a fulfilling relationship.
And the massive benefits that follow.
Love isn't enough.
It's about doing the individual work and
the relational work simultaneously.
Two therapists putting in the work
to make the best relationship possible.
So listen in and discover
how you can too.
We're John and Joree.
No, Joree and John.
It's about the and, not the order.
Okay, so we invite you on this week's journey
of why love isn't enough.
Hey, everyone. We are back. Finally, it makes me think about Jerry Maguire, one of my favorite movies, where he says, we are so very back. I don't know if he says that exactly, but it makes me think about that. We're back.
We're back.
We are back.
After a couple month hiatus.
So it wasn't quite our intention to take this long of a hiatus, but as they say, make plans and God will laugh.
Yeah. Better late than never.
Better late than never. So if this is your first time listening to Love Isn't Enough, or if you are back joining us, we will reintroduce ourselves. I am Joree Rose.
And I am Dr. John Schinnerer.
And I'm a therapist, I'm a psychologist, and we are in relationship with one another, been together over 9 years, engaged for 5 of those, living together finally after our teenage daughters went off to college.
And boy, do we have a story to share with you.
And yeah, life has been lifing.
It's been interesting. It's been challenging.
It has been challenging, and as I like to say, not no, but, and walking across the parking lot to one of the many doctor's office visits that we've had as I guided you in your near blindness, you asked me, do you think all these challenges have made us closer? Do you think it's brought us closer together? And
you said absolutely.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Resounding yes. So I think this is kicking off today's episode. The moral of the story is you can choose how challenge affects you.
Or we can quote Nietzsche and say that which doesn't kill you makes you stronger.
All of it's true.
Yeah.
So why have we been gone for so very long?
Well, because John went blind in his left eye.
John went blind. So we're going to share the story of John's blindness and the potential theories of said blindness, but more importantly, the tools we've put into practice, both individually and as a couple, which are consistent with what we teach our clients and how we choose to live our lives, that has helped us get through some really unforeseen circumstances, or in John's case, really unforeseen because he couldn't see at all.
Well, maybe we call this episode How to Deal When the Shit Hits the Fan.
It was weird. They think things just got kind of wonky in terms of these. I didn't see this coming. And I keep thinking of all these vision jokes. You didn't see it happening when it was actually happening.
Yeah. Well, and so let's back up and begin with the vacation where
Right.
we went to Madrid and Lisbon, and the intention was to go and see Cami, your daughter who was studying in Madrid. And then my daughter, Molly, and your other daughter, Ari, were joining us, and Ari was turning 21 and we were all going to be together. And we had 5 ER visits in a little over a week.
Well, let's even back up before the first ER visit. This trip was met with challenge from day one, right? Before we even had the first ER visit, we arrived in Madrid. And at that point, your daughter wasn't there yet. So you and me and my girls had our first day there. And our plan was to go to a food tour the next day. And our apartment, as many apartments are in Europe, with no side access to light because you're just in a building with only one window facing the street, we slept apparently really well.
Yeah.
It was nice and dark in there.
And we overslept.
And John wakes up and goes out to look out the window to determine it was actually daylight and realize it's 12:15 and our food tour starts at 12:30. And that was the beginning, I think, of how do we be resilient when...
Yeah. How do we deal with curveballs? How do you emotionally recover quickly? How do you be resilient?
And we were out the door in 10 minutes and all had a glass of wine for breakfast because that's what we were doing. Night.
And then Molly flew by herself and went to Frankfurt, Germany. And somehow the connecting flight got screwed up. Well, she missed her connecting flight and had to spend the night in Frankfurt. And that was a little bit unsettling.
That was a curveball.
And we got through that. And then she got to Madrid.
But that even affected some other things.
That's
Her
right.
missing her flight and having to stay overnight detoured the plans for the next day, which was Ari's 21st birthday. And we had a day trip planned to all go take a train ride out to the coast of Spain and spend a beautiful day at the coast. Well, Molly then was going to be arriving midday. We decided me and my girls would still go. And we get out early, get our Uber. Little did we know that there was actually every Sunday a marathon that goes through Madrid that shuts down streets. Long story short, we get to the train station with 1 minute to spare. We run up to the platform as we watch our train pull away. So here we were, met with yet another curveball.
So the day trip got scrapped.
That got scrapped, and we ended up getting tattoos. So,
Yeah.
there was that.
Yeah.
And we had actually a really fun
And that was a
day.
blast.
And I think that was the beginning of us all recognizing, wow, we're all pretty darn resilient right now, because all these things could have been hard to overcome, or the thought of how much money we might have lost on those train tickets, or what Molly had to spend to stay overnight in Germany. But none of that really surfaced because we've been teaching these girls for years. Stay present, breathe, don't over personalize.
How to recover quickly. How do you bring your physiology back to a resting space?
Yeah.
And then shortly after that, Molly got an injury to her left eye. And I think it was the day after, she couldn't leave her room. She just wanted to stay in a dark room because she couldn't open her eye. And I was like, oh man, like I got to take her to the ER. And so we go to the ER in Madrid, and turns out she has a scratch on her cornea that got infected. They were great. They gave her a ton of antibiotics to put into her eyes every 2 hours, including throughout the night. And that was kind of the start of, well, I guess I don't even know if it was the start. It was the continuation of the debacle of a vacation,
which then in turn prevented her from joining us on another day trip. So again, more resiliency on her part to stay back and for us to still go ahead. And we made the best of it every step of the way.
We recovered every step,
every single step.
And then I had to take Molly back to the hospital 2 days later to check up on the eye, and that seemed to be healing okay. And then you and I went to Lisbon, Portugal by ourselves.
Yeah, we had Thanksgiving there, and we were only supposed to be there for a few days.
Yeah.
Which we were only there for 3 days. And one of my absolute favorite things to do when we travel is food tours. I love eating around the world. I love learning about cultures through food around the world. So we had a food tour scheduled for the day after we got there, and we had the whole morning open. And we thought, oh, well, let's get a little tour of the city. Let's look at these cute little tuk-tuks that can drive us around and teach us about the history. And that was actually fantastic. Had a great guide, super fun.
Yeah. And then we went to the food tour, and we were about 2/3 of the way through the food tour. It's now evening, and I'm sitting there at a table with, I don't know, 10 other people. And I realize, holy shit, like I can't see anything out of my left eye. I've just gone blind in my left eye.
And we were being social, so we weren't sitting next to each other at this point. And you come up to me at the end of this particular food stop and you say, hey, hon, I think something's wrong. I realized I turned to look at the guy next to me and I couldn't see him. And pretty quickly, we made the decision to leave the food tour and go right to the ER because you have a history of a retinal issue. So you had some intuition of, aside from not being able to see, that we need to get help immediately.
Yeah. And some people are like, oh, it's a stroke. And I'm like, no, it's not a stroke. It's retinal in nature.
Right.
And so we went to the ER the first night and spent, I don't know, 3 hours there. Yeah.
3.5 hours. And they didn't speak much English there. And it was a great hospital. And thank goodness for Google Translate to kind of be taking pictures of the kiosks to know what we needed to input our information. But we left there about 10 o'clock with really no help.
With nothing. Because they had no ophthalmologist there on staff.
Other than come back tomorrow.
Yeah.
Well, despite the fact that John couldn't see anything, and if you've never been to Lisbon, it's akin to San Francisco, very hilly. Narrow streets,
narrow sidewalks,
lots of stairs, cobblestone. So needless to say, difficult to navigate if you have two working eyes. So I was leading him around half blind,
Yeah. Difficult to maneuver without depth perception.
Right. And we decided, well, we haven't had dinner yet because we left the food tour and that would have been really during the day, and ended up going to a neighborhood restaurant right near our Airbnb. And this was another point of resiliency because despite the fact that John went blind in Portugal, we actually had
Yeah.
a great visit, a great couple of hours, a couple of days.
It's a really interesting experience because I'm working pretty hard to stay calm over this 3-day period that we're in Portugal, because really easy to go down the rabbit hole of I'm going blind, I'm losing my vision, like what's going on, like really easy to panic.
And you did amazingly well.
Yeah,
amazingly
thanks.
well. And I think that's a result of years worth of you practicing these tools, the tools of mindfulness, of acceptance, of presence, of how to get out of a spiral when you start going in one. Yeah. And I want to highlight this restaurant experience because it's also shows one of our top values, which I think we've talked about in previous podcast episodes, which is the power of connection. And there were 2 waiters at this restaurant that we connected with so deeply, and partly for 2 reasons. One, when they said, "How you doing?" John's like, "Well, I'm blind in this eye. This just happened. We just came from the hospital and now we're here." And the first waiter, Ricardo, just had the most beautiful compassion I've ever seen, I think ever, from a stranger. Yeah. He softened and he put his arm around you and he looked pained for your experience. And that right there just felt safe. What does it feel for you?
It was a vulnerable share and he responded to it beautifully.
He did.
And so immediately in that moment, there's deep connection.
And there's trust.
And so it felt very warm and comforting.
Yeah, it was
because I was scared.
Absolutely.
I mean, and like it's a scary situation, don't get me wrong.
Well, and he did a great job of not having any anxiety over your fear or discomfort. There was something magical about that response. If more people could respond that genuinely to someone's vulnerability or fear, my God, we would feel so much safer in this world.
Yeah. Well, and we know that you can collapse, creating new friendships down from 200 hours to 45 minutes by doing a vulnerable share and having that vulnerability met safely.
Right.
Or kindly or compassionately.
It was beautiful. So despite the fact that, this was going on, all in all, it was still a good day. And I don't think that was just my perception of, looking for the good. We had a 3.5-hour detour. You were really scared and we got through it.
Yeah.
So we get up the next morning, go back to the hospital. And
that's where we met Dr. Phillip, right?
Dr. Phillip.
Yeah.
Dr. Phillip had our heart.
Dr. Phillip was very handsome. I think we both agreed upon that.
We both agreed upon. And I keep saying he must have been a really, really good doctor and good at what he does, because he could have gotten by on life just by his looks alone. So the fact that he chose to be an ophthalmologist and come in on a Saturday to help us in emergency just really showed how much he cared.
Yeah. And he examined me and there wasn't much he could do. He said, you've got a retinal tear. We can't see past the blood, but the tear probably bled, your eye filled with blood, and that's why you can't see. And you're safe to fly home, which is good. So there's no detached retina at that point.
Fly home the next day.
Yeah.
And that was one of the fears of, oh shit, what if we get stuck here for a few weeks and you can't fly?
Right.
And we have that ER visit, and that gave us some comfort that we could get home safely. And again, another point of resilience. We had a great afternoon. We explored a little bit. We had a great meal, sat by the water. I was pleased that we still got to experience where we were. It would have been so easy for you to fall into a depressive cycle, to go back to the room, to woe is me, and to just sit there until we had to leave. And
you had to hide in the room.
I probably would have done that. I mean, you have experience with your eyes, so somewhat knew how to manage this. And I like to share a lot more frequently when I'm in discomfort. So I might have had a little bit of a harder time. So I'm really, really praising you and your resilience here, because your ability to be where you were and still appreciate where you were and make the most out of it was remarkable.
Yeah. Thank you.
And we actually ended up going back to that same restaurant that second night
Yeah.
because it felt like such a sense of community.
Yeah.
And the second waiter who we connected with, we were laughing. We almost shut the place down there till like almost 1 a.m.
Yeah.
Bonding. And again, connection. It's all about connection. Those two waiters and that little corner restaurant made part of our experience there.
Yeah. And the food was amazing too. And G wrote us this really nice note on a napkin, didn't he?
He did. I still have that.
It was very sweet. And so then it was time to go home, which, you know, I had some relief over. I was like, well, at least I can get home and we can follow up on this and figure out what's actually going on. And so we get on the plane and we fly from Lisbon to Toronto and then Toronto to San Francisco. Well, when we're in Toronto, my stomach starts feeling upset. And I'm like, huh, that's kind of weird. And we get on the plane.
We had lunch.
Jeez.
We had lunch on that layover.
We get on the plane, and I think I threw up twice before the plane even left the ground.
Yeah, he was sitting in his seat. He was not well. So much so that the flight attendants come over. We were just backing out from the gate, and he's throwing up into a bag. And the flight attendant comes over and says, the pilot wants to know if you feel safe to fly.
Mm-hmm.
And if you don't, we'll push back to the gate and you can get off the plane.
And I'm thinking, well, the last thing I want to do is be stranded in Toronto. So I'm like, yeah, I'm good to fly.
Not knowing what was wrong.
And that was not the right answer at some level, because I spent the next 5.5 hours throwing up every 10 minutes.
It was horrific. And I've never seen him so sick. I've never felt so helpless. I felt really bad for the guy sitting next to me on the window aisle because John's just, you know, sitting on the aisle here, just throwing up pretty consistently. About halfway through that flight, the flight attendants come over and they say, do you want medical assistance? And
at first I was like, no. And then I was like, a couple seconds later, I was like, yeah.
Yeah. So they make the call on the plane. You know, there's been a medical emergency on board. If you're a doctor, please ring your call button. 2 doctors come over.
So now I'm a medical emergency.
Yeah.
Great. Not embarrassing at all.
So these 2 doctors come over and they start triaging him with 3 flight attendants, 2 doctors just standing in the middle of this pretty narrow plane, only 3 seats in an aisle on either side or one aisle, and determining that it wasn't life-threatening. You weren't having a heart attack. You weren't having a stroke. There was no major, do we need to land this plane emergency.
And they had some meds to help with the vomiting, but I couldn't keep them down enough for them to have an impact.
And they were super kind to move some seats around and place some, you know, musical chairs to get him to the back of the plane to attempt to lie down.
Yeah.
And I stood pretty much the rest of the time because he was lying down across 3 seats. The doctor was in the aisle seat next to me on the other side. And couldn't keep any of the Zofran down. They actually were able to do a little blood test to see if your blood sugars were okay. I mean, I was actually kind of impressed on what they were able to do.
Well, and I mean, at that point, I'm having muscle cramps and spasms, super dehydrated. And they asked me, you know, do you want the paramedics and an ambulance to meet us when we pull up to the gate? And I'm like, shit, seriously? Like, and at first I'm like, no. And then I think I threw up again and I'm like, yeah.
Well, and the doctor next to me, she was like, no, he needs to be seen as soon as possible, because I guess it takes about 2 hours for the pilot to convey to the paramedics in preparation to have that upon landing. What we didn't know is if you ever have paramedics meet you upon arrival, it is now actually declared an emergency landing. And at one point, the pilot announces that there's been a medical emergency, like he, you know, from his earlier announcement, but you can literally feel the plane speed up.
Yeah.
And the pilot actually landed about 30 minutes earlier, which was amazing. And once they land, the pilot comes back on and everyone, please stay in your seats. We're in the very back row of the plane. And these paramedics come on with a very narrow wheelchair.
Yeah. Which was not embarrassing at all again. And they, you know, kind of get me into the wheelchair and I'm being taken out of the plane down the aisle backwards. And I'm just like, sorry about that. I'm sorry. Because I'm thinking like I'm patient 0 that's just exposed this whole plane full of people to some god awful stomach flu.
Right. And meanwhile, don't mind you, he's still blind in one eye.
Yeah.
This is less than 48 hours after he lost his vision.
Yeah. It was a rough couple of days.
So the paramedics do some triage at the gate. They determine he needs to get into that ambulance. I think they try to get you to stand up. You almost fell
Yeah,
over.
I was pretty weak.
And they put him on a gurney, and we got taken to a service elevator down to the tarmac, to like the underbelly of the airport where an ambulance was waiting.
Mm-hmm.
And I took some photos for, social proof of, wow, look what we're getting through. I mean, whoever gets to see the under part of the airport like that,
And we got to skip customs.
yeah,
That was exciting.
Yeah, that was.
But so they took us to the ER, spent about 4 hours in the ER, got fluids in me, got the vomiting under control, and then got home about 2:33 in the morning.
Yeah.
And it was brutal.
Oh, we got home, and I woke us up as early as I could because we needed to get you to the eye doctor.
Right.
So we barely had maybe 5.5 hours of sleep before going into the eye doctor, still not sure what's wrong with him from his stomach, but needing to get seen.
Yeah. So saw the retinal specialist, feeling like hell. And then a couple of days later, we found out from the lab results from the ER that it was E. coli that I had that was causing the throwing up, which is not contagious. So that was the good news.
Yeah, the county health department called.
Yeah, I spent an hour on the phone. They were trying to trace down what the origin of the E. coli was. I'm like, well, it was in Spain. And they're like, oh, okay, cool. Like, we don't have to worry about that here.
Well, and that's a really interesting thing too, because at this point, well, actually, 2 days after the day after we got home, my stomach started to hurt.
Mm-hmm.
And I took the Zofran to stave off. I'm like, oh shit, I just saw what he went through. I do not want to go through that. So I was nauseous for a few days, but was able to otherwise be okay. And we were super confused on the origins of this E. coli once we found out what that was, because where did we eat that you had something that none of the rest of us would have eaten? Because we were with our kids in Spain. Everywhere we went, we all tasted each other's food. Mm-hmm. You and I probably shared the most food. Yeah. And they said the incubation period was 7 days.
Right.
So it couldn't have been food from Portugal. It must have originated in Spain. But the fact that nobody else really got it was a big head scratcher.
Yeah. So there was some recovery from that. The retinal specialist said, yeah, there's a tear and a bleed most likely, but we can't really see behind the blood. So we're going to have to just sit and watch it.
So from that point, this is the beginning of December, because the loss of vision happened the day after Thanksgiving. And every couple of weeks, we would go back to the eye doctor. Mm-hmm. And, again, the resilience, you couldn't work out, you couldn't drive. It was difficult to work. Oh, at one point we got an eye patch for you, kind of cool pirate look. But you dealt with it amazingly well.
Yeah, thanks.
I mean, dealing with fear of the unknown, discomfort, dependency on me. Like, what was that like for you?
It's hard. Actually, I brought this up in the men's group last week, where I said, it was, and this was more so, that was hard. It was harder after the surgery that was coming, a couple months down the road, because the recovery from the surgery is just really, really difficult and trying. And I was telling them that, the question I had for my men's group was, when has something happened to you that made you feel like less of a man, and how did you deal with it? And I use this surgery recovery as my example, saying, look, can't drive, can't have sex, can't pick up anything heavy, can't even make money. Like, I couldn't see clients, I couldn't work on the computer. So a lot of
couldn't help around the house.
Yeah, a lot of what I do and part of my identity as a man was just erased. And it's really difficult to sit with for longer and longer periods of time. Now, fortunately, that was only 2.5 weeks post-surgery.
Right.
But, I've been blind in my left eye now for 4 months.
Right. Yeah, coming on 4 months. So, but slowly over time, and the way the Dr. Philip, the way that Dr. Philip described what was going on was, there was a tear and the eye filled with blood in the back of the eye. You wouldn't look at his eye and see anything. So it was all in the back of the eye, but that the blood needed to settle like snow in a snow globe. And once it settled, they would be able to see what the actual issue was. Yeah. So, we've been going to these follow-up appointments. Nothing was changing, but yet vision was slowly beginning to come back. And you thought, yeah, I'm improving. This is all good.
It's healing. Yeah. Which was best case scenario.
Right. And then the one appointment I didn't go with him to, because he was getting his vision back and he was beginning to drive again. You're at the doctor's
Then
office for 6.5 hours.
yeah, the retinal specialist took a look at one scan. I think it was an ultrasound, and said, yeah, it looks like you've got a bit of a retinal detachment. It looks like we're going to have to do surgery. Let me consult with the other specialist, and we'll schedule surgery. And when they make that decision, it's usually within 24 hours.
Oh yeah. And by the way, surgery is tomorrow.
Yeah. And, and backing up a little bit, because there's been times during this process where I have gotten a little bit depressed. The things have gotten to me, and I have lost a little bit of resolve and resiliency. And typically when I get there, I'll hear things in my head like, I can't deal with this. I can't take it anymore. I can't handle this. And I've learned over the years that when I hear those thoughts, immediately I'll start to challenge them and say, okay, look, this is difficult and I can handle this. This is challenging and I got this. This is tough and I can deal with this. And so I was always kind of reiterating those thoughts almost as mantras to help me stay grounded. And that was one of the key things that I did, along with deep breathing and
we'll get to the surgery recovery in a minute. But I think the other thing I could say you did really well was when those moments came up, you shared them with me. You didn't hold them in. And I think, and we live together now, so it would have been a lot harder for you to quote hide from me what you were feeling, because I could look at you and see where your emotional state was. And I'm really grateful that we were already living together during this process, because you would have had to move in no matter what. But the vulnerability, coming back to that vulnerability idea, to share with me, I'm really struggling right now.
I'm scared, or I'm struggling, or I'm having dark thoughts, or this is really hard, or I'm in a lot of pain.
And I'm in a lot of pain. And, it's an interesting dynamic that I've never really been in, that I want to speak to it as role. Well, let's get to the surgery first, and then we'll get to kind of the next piece, because I want to also share my experience of you, because I think that's a part that doesn't often get talked about when someone is going through an illness or a surgery or a recovery.
So the surgery happened, what, 2.5 weeks ago? Between 2.5, 3 weeks ago?
Yeah. So, from the time that we're pointing
February 5th.
Recording this. Oh, but quick, I'm throwing one other curveball with that. Simultaneous to this timing, we had made a decision, my ex-husband and John and my daughter and I, to withdraw her from college and to come home on medical leave for some challenges that she's happening. And that was another curveball. And how do we reset when the plan is no longer the plan? And when what we thought was going to look like and be like and feel like in our world that we've now created has changed. For her and her experience of being in college, for us as our experience as being empty nesters.
Yeah, we got 4 months in.
A few months in. It was a great run. And we will have another great run eventually. And it's all fine. But I want to point that out, because I think the key in all of this has been communication and resilience at every which level. And in absence of communicating everything you're feeling and thinking, it's easy to hold it in. And the more you hold it in, the more it grows. And when we can name it and talk about it and give it room to exist without judging, it makes it a lot easier to deal with.
It doesn't stand up well to the light of day, kind of like shame.
I was just going to say, kind of like shame. So the day that he had surgery was a little chaotic for me, because I had to drive him they had to do one more scan at the doctor's office to confirm surgery was necessary. So we went there at 3:00, got to the hospital at 4:00, got checked into the hospital. I had to leave the hospital at 4:30 to go drive to the airport to pick up my daughter coming home from college, home for a somewhat indefinite amount of time, get her settled, drive home in rush hour traffic, have dinner with her, get back to the hospital, and your surgery had been pushed off. So when I got back to the hospital, you were still in surgery. I don't think your surgery ended till 12:30 at night.
Yeah, it was a 3-hour surgery. It was pretty
long.
Significant.
Yeah, it was long. And I, of course, was getting worried. And by the time we checked out, got home at about 2 a.m.
Yeah.
And it felt very supportive of some of my friends to say, do you want me to go sit with John at the hospital? Can you be in 2 places at once? And luckily I could in this scenario, but to also have that vulnerability to share with others, like, this is a lot for me to be balancing the fear and anxiety of you being in surgery. I would have preferred to have stayed the whole time at the hospital, perceived sense of safety or protection that I could be there. I also wanted to be there full time with my daughter, who was just coming home. and the grace that she had as soon as we got home for me to go back to the hospital. So grace and compassion and acceptance
Cognitive flexibility.
on all of it. Like, just, I invite you to consider, what challenges have you had in your life in which any of those things are hard?
One, I do like the idea that, the surest path to misery is resisting reality as it is.
Mhm.
And so the more resistant I was, or yeah, the more resistant I was to any of these curveballs, the more difficult things get exponentially. And I
100%.
remember, like being in prep for surgery, and I have my go-to defense strategy is humor. And whenever I have surgery, and I've had a few at this point in my life, I'm always trying to make jokes and make the people around me laugh. And my thought is, I want to make them relaxed and
The
comfortable.
people around you being the nurses and doctors.
Nurses and doctors, yeah, because
yeah.
I know that they will perform their best to the extent they're relaxed.
Yeah.
If they're uptight and tense and stressed, they're not going to perform as well.
Yeah.
And so went into that surgery with some trepidation. I mean, it's never those are tough surgeries. They're quite invasive. So they went in, they did a vitrectomy. So they go into the eyeball, they smooth out the retina, they inject a gas bubble in the eye, they sew the eye shut, which is crazy. There's microsutures in the eyeball. There was a silicone band that was lasered onto the backside of my eye. So now I've got matching silicone bands on one on either eye, because I've had the surgery twice before on the right eye. And then got to come home.
Yeah. And home was fine for the first couple of days. Part of the recovery of this is he's got to be face down for 7 full days,
24 hours a day,
which probably ended up being maybe like 22 and a half hours, still eating.
But it's difficult. It's really difficult.
Facing the ground. We had to rent equipment like face cradles, like massage chairs, like you would have to cradle the face to be able to stay face down, even for sleeping.
And so that would have just been annoying. And I've done that before. The problem came 2 days after surgery, when the pressure in my eye went
Increased.
3.5 times normal. And, normally it's around 10. It went up to like 35, 36. And at 40 is where the alarm bells start going off, where they are looking at surgical alternatives or options to decrease the pressure.
But what his experience was intense pain.
Yeah.
In which no medication could touch, because it wasn't a headache, it wasn't tension, it was pressure building.
Pressure building on the inside of my eye, pushing outwards.
And it was horrific this sounds like, I don't know the right word. It was horrible for me to watch. I can't even imagine what it must have been like in your own skin. There were moments where he couldn't find a position, kind of writhing in pain, and how to get through 24 hours a day, because we didn't get relief for that until about 5 days.
Yeah. And they gave me so they start you off on 3 eye drops, 3 medications. And when the eye pressure increased, they added 4 or 5 more.
4 more drops in a pill.
Yeah. And the eye drops themselves are problematic and uncomfortable. But they weren't, I thought that they would reduce the pressure within I was hoping 2 hours, and then I'm hoping 12 hours, and then I'm hoping a day. And it turned out to be 5.
About 5 days.
And that was really, really difficult. And I started towards the end of day 4.5, 5, I started having some pretty dark thoughts, just take the eyeball. I can't deal with this anymore. It's not worth it. I'd rather just sew the whole thing shut.
Mm-hmm. How'd you get through that?
Same thing. I kept going back to, this is difficult and I can handle this, and breathing. And, I would try and find ways to alleviate the pain, even if it was only for seconds. Like the warm compress would help for minutes. And so that was helpful. And then once that 5-day window passed, things were much easier.
Yeah. And, I think part of the thing to ease the anxiety was we just kept going back to the doctor. Sometimes we showed up with no appointment because we needed the knowledge of where is the eye pressure at.
Well, and it's bad when the retinal specialist says, come on and drop by the clinic anytime you want.
Yeah.
They're busy as hell.
Yeah.
And so for them to say that, it's not the best indicator in my mind. Now the question kind of that interests me about this whole thing is that
can I say one more piece before we go into that? Before that, I was going to say, it was really, really hard. I felt incredibly helpless.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't, you were the one suffering. And I was also suffering in a different capacity. And every now and then I would, like, I sometimes just looked at you and started to cry because the pain he was in, I knew was horrific. And after the fact, once everything subsided, I recently asked, were you really honest with how bad it was?
And I said, no, I wasn't. I was minimizing it.
Yeah. And I didn't, and I think I knew that, which is part of the challenge I had in bearing witness to that. And once the eye pressure significantly went down after one of the appointments from which we just showed up, and at that point the meds were working, I had this letdown response in which I just burst into tears, and I felt really guilty for struggling with you having this horrible recovery. I felt my emotions don't matter here. I was a little bit feeling burnout of just managing, caregiving,
Sure.
but that wasn't really terrible. It was more of just I feel helpless. This has been so hard. And I felt guilty for having any emotion when I wasn't the one in surgery and recovery.
Well, but we know because of empathy, you're going to experience the pain that I feel to some extent.
Right.
And I knew full well that you were suffering along with me.
Yeah.
And you can argue to what degree, but I know that's how it works.
And you had even said to me at one point, I think you've said it twice, is I wouldn't want to have been in your shoes. I would have rather be the one in pain than if you had to watch me be in that much pain. And I just think it's an important thing to name, because I think those in caregiver roles, right, there's many challenges. There's the, I have to do all the work, or I am the only one capable of doing all these things right now. And I'm used to doing that. So that was less of what was hard for me. It was just, my partner is in pain. He's struggling. I'm scared. I didn't want to name my fears. And that was really hard. And that was part of my letdown after we got home. It was actually Valentine's Day that day. And I remember we just went to lie down and I just started to sob. And then I felt guilty that I'm crying to you about your own suffering. But I want to normalize any emotion.
Yeah.
And your grace of holding space at that point for me was so loving. And I think when you're really connected with someone, how could you not have that level? How could I not have that level of fear, anxiety, overwhelm? I wasn't going to name it in the moment. And you also did an amazing job, especially during that eye pressure, of not going dark, maybe twice for an hour or two.
Yeah, it was pretty limited.
Quick. And I was really pleased on that, because I would have had a hard time not going down the rabbit hole with you. And I would have felt naive to just try to pull you out, right? Because I didn't know the degree to which you were actually suffering. So I just want to give a shout out to those who are holding space for those they love who are in extreme pain or suffering, or kind of whatever recovery they're in.
Yeah.
It was hard.
And so then the next piece is kind of the why. Why did this happen? And it's a little frustrating because you can talk to ophthalmologists and retinal specialists and optometrists and not get the same answer and not get a straight answer, because I really think they don't know. I think there's a lot we don't know. And one possibility I heard on a materialistic physical level is, violent shearing. So kind of that quick start stop to your head, almost like heading a soccer ball, or, stopping a car and hitting your head against the dash or something like that might lead to a retinal tear if you've got those predispositions. And so we were thinking, well, we went on the tuk-tuk ride. We were going on bumpy cobblestone roads, and, there was no real shocks in the tuk-tuk. So maybe there was some shaking that happened that kind of loosened up something. And I had, there was 10 retinal tears in this eye 2 years ago, and they had lasered all those shut. So not that hard to open up one of those tears, I think.
That was a plausible explanation given where we were at, because it was the only thing that we could turn to say, why did this happen? Well, a couple hours ago, we were on a bumpy road. Now I can't see.
And that was about 4 hours prior to losing vision.
Right. And did it slowly go away, or was it kind of immediate?
It slowly went away over the course of that food tour.
Okay. So about 2.5 hours.
Yeah.
And so for a long time, that was our working definition.
Yeah,
and
that was
like, oh, damn, there goes tuk-tuk rides forever.
Yeah, because you kind of you're looking for an explanation. You're looking for a cause, and even to look at, what do I avoid in the future?
Sure.
Like, I don't think I'm going on roller coasters anytime soon, for example. But
tuk-tuk rides?
I don't know. It depends on the road.
Yes, it's going to depend on the
shocks. And then you went to get a massage.
Mm-hmm. I have a masseuse I've been going to for 21 years, and she's magic. She's an intuitive healer, and it's always more like a therapy somatic release session. And so we sat for about 30 minutes prior to the massage, and I'd caught her up on all the things that were going on so she could work it out of my body. And about 5 minutes into my massage, she says to me, I think John's loss of vision was a shamanic injury. And we'll explain what that means if you don't know what that means, but it made sense in that it was a spiritual explanation. Mm-hmm. And we've been on a spiritual journey, and we haven't shared all of the stories on this podcast. We've done it on our individual ones, but I think we're going to revisit that here for those who haven't heard. But it opened the door to another lens of consideration. Mm-hmm. And I come home from the massage. I said, John, Madeline thinks it was a shamanic injury. You need to call Pasha. Pasha is another intuitive healer that we've been working with that actually was introduced to John when his eyesight had these 10 retinal tears 2 years ago. Mm-hmm. And that was kind of the entree in. So it seemed quite logical to bring it back to Pasha and have a conversation around what could be a spiritual explanation to this eye injury. So here's where, you got to have some suspension of disbelief. You might be listening and think this all sounds like bullshit. I'm going to stick with the tuk response and believe that there's only tangible evidence from what we can see in front of us. Mm-hmm. And we're just opening up another lens of possibility. And one of our takeaways is choose the interpretation that serves you best.
Yeah. I mean, there's a point in life, or a point in time in my life when I could only go with the materialistic, scientific-based explanation. And I think we've gotten more into the woo-woo or the spiritual or whatever.
I love that about you.
And we've encountered some really hard to refute experiences that point in that direction. Mm-hmm. And we won't go into all those in this one. We'll just keep it more current. But so I met with Pasha, and she said, yeah, it was definitely a spiritual injury. You got to remember, she's told me before that I'm a shaman. I would never say that because I don't think I know nearly enough to say anything like that. I'm open to learning more about it. She says,
for simpler terms, a healer. That feels, in our line of work, we are working on helping people heal.
Yeah,
so
it's another level of healing, spiritual healing. And she said that you got to remember your contract is with the land.
Spiritual contract, that is.
And so you can't just travel around the world without taking proper precautions. Grounding, visualization, shielding, that sort of thing.
Protection.
And she's like, did you do any of that? I said, no, actually, I'd been doing it at home, but I totally forgot to do it when we were on vacation because I was on vacation and didn't even think about it. And she said, I think what happened is you picked up a curse from the land and cleansed the land, but you took the curse into yourself. So,
and not only did you take the curse in, but the E. coli was you purging the curse.
Yeah.
Part of it. So we might have just lost half of you in this explanation. So if you're still here,
here's where it gets, I don't know, even stranger, that during that food tour, we walked to a church plaza with a church that had been around since the 1500s, was involved in the Spanish Inquisition. And this church had been through, I think, 2 earthquakes, a fire, and a tsunami. And at one point they decided, we're not going to rebuild this church because it's cursed.
Walking inside, all of the walls are charred. I mean, it's kind of eerie in there because it's still grand and beautiful and old, and you can feel the darkness in there.
And in that plaza in front of the church, back in the 1500s, there was a 3-day riot in which Jews and new Christians were killed, burnt alive in pyres at the stake.
The new Christians, by the way, were the Jews who fled Spain from the Spanish Inquisition and were forced to convert. So the new Christians, quote unquote, were Jews by birth.
And so if you're going to pick up a curse from land, that seems like a pretty decent place to do it
Yeah,
in
there's
my
a lot of shit
mind.
that went down there.
And so I started going blind about 2.5 hours after that.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I don't know what is true. I don't know what
Capital T, true.
the reality is. I do know I'm going to take steps to protect myself here and when I travel.
Mm-hmm.
Because I've seen enough at this point in my life to know that not everything can be viewed through or explained by the scientific paradigm, although I'm a big fan of the scientific paradigm. I believe it's inherently limited.
Mm-hmm.
It's limited to empiricism, to what we can see with what we can experience with our senses. But there's more going on in this world than what we can merely experience with our senses. I mean, just look at, a dog's sense of smell or an owl's sense of vision. I mean, they can sense things far beyond what our human senses can. And
Still
so
real.
to think that I'm taking in all of reality merely through my five senses is somewhat arrogant and misguided, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. So let me ask you this. When we were under the belief that the vision was lost as a result of the tuk-tuk, how did you feel with that belief?
I think I was a little bit defeated because it made me feel a little bit weak in the sense that there was physical limitations to what I could do and not do.
How did you then feel in perhaps choosing to believe more in alignment with this spiritual experience of something that may make no logical sense, but that you had some spiritual burden come upon you as a result of the openness of your heart, as a result of your energy, as a result of your healing, but like whatever the qualities you have that made you susceptible to that, how did that then feel as a potential explanation?
I think it's empowering because I think it puts a layer of meaning on what happened that wasn't there before. Mm. And if it's true that I pulled a curse from the land and helped that land in some way, and this was kind of how I dealt with the after effects, then it becomes to some extent worth it.
So here's the interesting question, because there's still an interplay of tangible reality and spiritual belief. Because even if it was a quote curse from the land that you picked up, you still had a retinal tear. Mm-hmm. There was still a physical eye injury.
Both are true.
Even if you got E. coli, which yes, your blood or your stool sample, whatever it was, determined that this was the infection that caused all the vomiting. Whether or not that actually happened, we're still confused on how and where and why did I not get more of that? And yet the belief that maybe that was a purge of what you took in, right? Mm-hmm. So there are still the tangible results of what might have been a spiritual cause.
Yes. And I think the other thing that enters into this, it's kind of interesting, coincidental, synchronous, is, Molly's eye injury was the same eye.
Right.
And she doesn't remember anything that led to her scratching her eye.
So when we look up, whenever there's an injury or like numbers or animals, I'm always curious, what's the spiritual meaning? Mm-hmm. So to you, what was the spiritual meaning of you and Molly having an eye injury?
It feels like an attack on the masculine side of me.
Isn't the left side though feminine?
I thought left was masculine.
I think left is feminine.
Oh.
And I think it comes in feminine, goes out masculine. Am I wrong?
I don't know.
Okay. Anyhow.
But I think that's part of it. I think part of the meaning there is, what am I supposed to see in a new way? What am I not seeing accurately? What do I need to look at differently?
And that's a very tangible question. Mm-hmm. How can I see things differently? The spiritual response to that would be activating your third eye.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. It's getting out of my head and into more heart-based perception or third eye perception.
Intuition.
Yeah.
So how have you done that throughout all this? What was the thing you've seen differently so far, if anything? We didn't prep these questions for something on the spot. Anything?
I think for me, it's been a ongoing journey into the unseen, the unknown, different domains. I have played around with shamanic journeys and going to the underworld and finding familiars or animals that can accompany me.
Protect you.
Looking more for ways to protect myself if, in the event that all this is true at the spiritual level. And, I think to me in my life, I look at, there's been kind of these waves of development where when I was young, it was more, I was trying to figure out my physical body. And then it became intellectual development. And then it became emotional development. And then it became relational development. And finally, I think we're at this phase of spiritual development. And so I think it's, the question of, if I look at this level of development with curiosity, with open-mindedness, what can I learn? What can I discover?
I love that. And, to kind of make it really applicable, regardless of what anyone's going through, there's an opportunity to say, what's another lens I can look through? What's another possible reframe in how I can think about this? And I think that's one of my favorite tools actually to teach clients is we get really stuck on narratives. And oftentimes those narratives are born out of a previous time in our life, out of a trauma, out of a situation in which we were needing survival strategies in some capacity. And we hold on to those belief systems or patterns or thoughts or the way we process, and those get outdated. I like to say we don't upgrade our operating system. Mm-hmm. And so I love that idea of what's another lens I can look through.
Yeah. And I think one of the things I will always ask myself in tragic or difficult circumstances is, what am I supposed to learn from this? And one of the big ones to me is cognitive flexibility, right? So can I be open-minded? Can I be curious? Can I look at situations through different lenses or different angles to see what's possible?
Yeah.
And I think that's huge. I'm a big fan of flexible thinking.
Yeah. And relationally, as this, podcast is about relationships, how would you, because I have some ideas here, how would you relate that more relationally of what is there to learn here?
Well, I don't know if this is answering the question specifically, but I think it came up in the question that I asked you of, to what extent do you think these difficulties have made us or brought us closer together? Mm-hmm. And I felt that as I asked the question, which is right. Why I asked the question. And I think that we've also been able to come together or find common ground in this spiritual sandbox, in the spiritual playground. And there's been some really pretty exciting, pretty awe-inspiring, incredible events that have happened over the past 2 years where, by my way of looking at it, it's just way beyond coincidence. Like some of this, like you can't make this shit up. Like it's too improbable.
Yeah. I think for me, the relational piece it's just that. It's something you said to me. We were dating only about 3.5 months, and I had 2 medical things happen in 1 month, and like surgical procedures. And you had from the very get-go said, we will get through this. We are a we. And I remember thinking, wow, we're a we. That was such different language from what I was used to hearing. And I love that the we-ness of these past challenges, it wasn't oh, John is suffering. It's no, we're suffering because I am right there with you. And knowing that we are a we did make me actually feel more comfortable to express my part in that, of where I was struggling, that it wasn't selfish for me to think about myself, or it wasn't this either or. It's we both are having a very real and honest and vulnerable response to these circumstances.
Yeah.
And the safety and trust that we've built to express any of them without judgment, I think is phenomenal. And that's, I think also a reflection of the work that we have done. And we think it's like the root of all relationship challenge and healing is looking at our attachment wounds. And having previously had, I was anxious, you were avoidant in our attachment style, had we still been stuck in those patterns, would have been, I think, making these curveballs a lot harder, harder, because my anxious attachment would have struggled when you were inaccessible as a result of your surgery or loss of eyesight. And I would have felt perhaps a little bit more dysregulated in what I needed as far as partnership.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel such a sense of safety and security. None of that ever once came into play. And a few years ago, that might have been harder.
Yeah, no, I agree.
And for you, if I could speak, and you can correct, but having had an avoidant attachment might have been harder to lean into vulnerability with me.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, what else would have been there?
To ask for support, to receive the love and nurturing and nursing that you gave to me would have been a challenge.
And to bring it back to what you said in the beginning, that at some point did challenge your masculinity, but it didn't bring upon shame, which often is a key cornerstone for those in it with avoidant. And so I love these examples of these curveballs, because those 10 days in Europe, it literally felt like one after the other, and they were varying degrees of intensity or consequence, but nonetheless, I mean, waking up 15 minutes before we're supposed to be somewhere could have put us all irritable, all blaming each other. Why didn't you wake us up? It's your fault. We could have not been present and enjoyed. That wasn't the case once. I mean, despite all the ER visits over the 10 days, I'm like, that was actually a pretty good trip.
We still had fun. We still had fun interspersed throughout.
We did. And I think that's remarkable, because by no sense was this trip a flop or a failure.
Yeah.
And I don't like the word failure, but one could see it through that lens if they were stuck on seeing things as only as good or bad, positive or negative.
And just to bring it full circle, so the prognosis for my eye is we don't know anything until maybe a month from now, when the bubble kind of shrinks and we'll see what my vision looks like. Pretty good chance that I'll have to have the surgery again. We don't know that yet, but that would probably be in a year. Definitely we'll have to have a corneal replacement, like I did on the other eye, which that's not that big a deal. That's outpatient, 15, 20 minutes. So I do believe that the eye will heal enough and I will see again out of this eye, because that's been my experience with my right eye.
And I have great confidence in that.
Yeah.
And I also want to just say one last piece is, there were moments where I think both of us had to consider, oh shit, what if this doesn't repair?
Mm-hmm.
And even that was a point of resilience to say, you know what, could we live with that? Could we live with you having only one eye? And we could.
Mm-hmm.
It wouldn't have been ideal, and we would have adjusted even then. So I found great comfort that even if that worst case scenario came true, knock on wood, it didn't, and I'm hopeful and confident it won't, given your history with your other eye. But if we get stuck on that worst case scenario, then we're stuck in that suffering cycle. And so I'm hoping that as you're listening to this, you're not just hearing our storytelling, but really understanding what tools we put into play to make these past 4 months not awful,
mm-hmm.
despite what could otherwise be named as some pretty awful times.
And these tools take practice. They're not one and done.
No.
And the more tools you learn, the better things get, the happier you are, the more satisfied you are with life.
And I love this idea that you have to build them outside of the moments of overwhelm, chaos, or quote emergency, because you can't prepare for it in the midst of the emergency.
Yeah, I couldn't have just started practicing mindfulness or loving kindness or reframing or not catastrophizing during that emergency that took place in Lisbon.
No, it's not possible.
It never would have worked.
And so it's something we teach, it's something we live by. And I think this whole experience, this whole episode is really evidence of, we literally practice everything we teach on a daily basis. This is ongoing work. It's not like you learn it once and you put it away in your file cabinet and you don't think about it again.
It's a lifetime of work.
It's building that muscle and then stretching that muscle over and over again. So thank you for sharing your story.
Yeah. And thank you to the listeners for listening.
And if any of this was inspiring to you, of wanting to say, I need more tools of resiliency, because, you know, our world's feeling pretty chaotic right now, John.
A little bit.
And there's a lot of uncertainty and unknown. And we know that that can be anxiety provoking and dysregulating. We do have some options of how you can build some of these tools. So I think our favorite one right now is our masterclass series that we have going on, where once a month we do a live masterclass on different areas in relationship growth and healing and insight and tool building and understanding. And you can join one that piques your interest, or you can sign up for the whole year and actually get a bonus coaching session with John and I. So the link for that masterclass series is in the show notes.
You can also go to loveisn'tenough.net. And then you can also find out there's a number of other classes that both Joree and I offer: anger management, mindfulness, anxiety, positive psychology, meditation.
I have a parenting one.
Most of these have similar tools in them.
Yeah. So we're a wealth of resources we would love to share with you.
Yeah.
Thank you guys so much. If also this episode inspired you and you want to share it with others, one of the best ways you could do that is to give it a rating, a review, or just simply copy and send the link to someone who you think might be interested in hearing it.
Share it with your friends.
We look forward to bringing you more stories and insights and crazy adventures and tools. So stay tuned for our next episode. Thank you so much for your time and attention, which is the currency of all relationships.
If you enjoyed this episode, please support us by leaving a review, sharing, or liking the podcast.
And visit loveisn'tenough.net for more info on the many ways you can work with us. Or follow us on Instagram at loveisn'tenough33.
And as always, keep learning and growing on your journey to master your relationships.